In the quiet village of Fern Hollow, where secrets were buried beneath flower beds and spoken only in lowered voices, the vicar's wife collapsed at a garden fete with a teacup still warm in her hand, and in that single silent fall, years of war, love, betrayal, and one forbidden truth stirred from the dead. Miss Marple had come for peace. What she found was a name scratched from history, and a boy who might carry the weight of a past the village dared never speak aloud. Miss Marple arrived in Fern Hollow beneath a sky dappled with gentle cloud and lark song. The village lay curled between wooded lanes and lazy riverbanks, its cottages huddled in ivy and thyme. She had been invited for a fortnight by the Reverend Alan Brett, newly appointed to the parish. A clever boy once, now a serious young man, with thinning hair and mild eyes. Alan had written to her out of fondness, and perhaps a touch of nervousness. "I thought," he had penned, "you might enjoy the quiet, and my wife would be grateful for a steady companion, someone discreet." That word had lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she stepped from the little motor car that brought her from the station. Discreet, not helpful, nor cheerful, nor even pleasant. No, he had wanted discretion. She was shown into the vicarage by a maid with anxious shoulders. The house was neat, rather more austere than most, with a scent of lavender polish and faint invisible rules. The young vicar welcomed her with gentle warmth, then vanished to attend to parish matters. It was Susie, his wife, who remained in the doorway of the drawing-room, watching. Susie Brett was by any village standard lovely, tall and refined in bearing, with a complexion pale as milk glass and dark intelligent eyes. Yet there was something in her that resisted welcome. The ladies of Fern Hollow, many of whom had expected a parson's wife in tweed and brisk charity, spoke of her in lowered tones. "She was a nurse, you know," said Mrs. Jeffer, leaning over the preserved stall at the market. "War work, some hospital near Oxford. She's not the sort to forget things," added Miss Harrow, the schoolmistress. "You can see it in her mouth, tight as a letter box." To Miss Marple's discerning ear, the tone was less envy than confusion. Susie was polite, but never warm. She walked the village with gloved hands and thoughtful steps, often lingering by the war memorial where the names of boys not much younger than Alan were carved into stone. No one could fault her devotion to duty. She arranged the flowers in church, visited the elderly, even taught needlework to the school girls. But she never quite belonged, and in a village like Fern Hollow, that did not go unnoticed. It was on the day of the garden fete that the stillness of Fern Hollow was undone. The sun, ever obliging, filtered through the chestnut branches as villagers gathered on the lawn of the vicarage. Bunting fluttered. Children dashed about with sticky fingers. Jam jars lined the tables, each boasting labels in loopy, competitive handwriting. Miss Marple had placed herself discreetly beneath the great tree, her knitting bag at her side, needles clicking gently. A cup of elderflower cordial rested beside her on a plate bearing one of the vicarage scone, quite dry but respectful. The vicar moved through the crowd, polite but faintly stiff. Susie, in a pale lilac dress that caught the light like frost on stone, stood at the table where tea was being served. She offered smiles, nods, a few quiet jokes that surprised those close enough to hear them. "She's blooming," someone whispered near the apple-bobbing tub. "Better than when she first came." Miss Marple raised her eyes briefly and noted the young woman's hands, steady, delicate, and white against the fine porcelain of her teacup. A moment later, Susie turned and glanced toward the war memorial at the far end of the lawn. Her face flickered, just once, with something too brief to name. It happened not with drama, but with a stillness so sudden it seemed to freeze the air. Susie had taken 2 steps toward the flower stall when her body faltered. A gentle sway, as though caught by a breeze, then a collapse, so soft it was almost graceful. Gasps rose like startled birds. Several rushed forward, the vicar among them. But Miss Marple had already lowered her knitting. She did not rise at once. Instead, she observed. Susie lay on her side, one hand curled into her skirt, the other still faintly damp from the tea. Her eyes were open, distant, and the color had drained from her lips. A shout went up for Dr. Partridge, who had been examining the jams. Within moments, the lawn had cleared of laughter. Children were ushered away, parasols lowered, cups left abandoned on white tablecloths. Someone fetched a cushion from the drawing room. Her maid ran for a blanket, but nothing changed the look in Cecil's eyes. Detached, staring gone. Miss Marple, with her hands folded in her lap, watched the scene unfold without comment. She noticed the teacup still lying on its side, and the single drop clinging to its rim. Dr. Partridge, though seasoned in coughs and kitchen burns, had seen death enough to know it when it came. He examined Cecily briefly, then rose with a troubled frown. It was quick, he murmured, mostly to the vicar. Very quick indeed. There was no wound, no sign of stroke or sudden fall. The heart, perhaps, or perhaps not. He would have to notify the authorities. The villagers, now dispersing in tight clusters along the path, exchanged wary glances. By dusk, whispers had taken shape. It was the tea, someone muttered at the post office. You saw her drink it. Poison, said another in the grocer queue under her breath. It's always poison, isn't it? The vicarage windows remained shuttered that evening. Miss Marple settled in the spare room with her rose chintz curtains, quietly unpacked her case. She had brought 2 novels, a bottle of lavender water, and a pair of well-worn gardening gloves. She left them untouched. In a small notebook tucked into her handbag, she made a brief notation. Afternoon tea. No bees, no wasps, cup untouched by others. The next morning brought a hush to Fern Hollow, one not of reverence, but of careful withdrawal. At the vicarage, arrangements were quietly begun, though there was no official ruling yet on Cecily's cause of death. Miss Marple sat in the parlor, her knitting forgotten, gazing out toward the rose bed. She had seen Alan Brett kneel beside his wife's body the day before, not with grief exactly, nor with horror. There had been a curious stillness to him, as though something in him had already accepted the loss. His hands had not trembled. He had not called out her name. He had touched her gently, yes, but more like a man turning a page than closing a chapter. Now, in the quiet aftermath, he spoke in careful phrases to the parish clerk, gave orders for hymns, asked that Cecil's favorite lees not be included. They reminded her of hospitals, he explained. Miss Marple noted that detail. She thought also of Cecil's last glance toward the war memorial, of the invisible thread between that look and the name engraved on the metal she had seen in the vicarage hallway, only briefly, yet with quiet significance. And as the first condolence cards began to arrive, she knew the story had only just begun. The bells of St. Swithin's tolled just once the following morning, half muffled, half inhabitual. Fern Hollow, like any English village, did not linger long in stunned silence. By the time the Women's Guild met at Mrs. Partridge's home that Wednesday, the horror of Cecily Brett's sudden death had transformed into something altogether more productive. Speculation. Such a strange business, remarked Miss Harrow as she set down her biscuit, eyes flicking over her spectacles. So young and so still. I said to Mavis only this morning, chimed in Mrs. Ridgway. No one collapses like that without something amiss. The doctor looked quite put out. I thought it was the tea, murmured Mrs. Lyle from the corner. You all saw her with it. And wasn't the Reverend rather calm? Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting untouched. It was not her habit to interfere, particularly when a village's natural machinery of chatter was already well in motion. She listened not only to what was said, but to what was not said. The Women's Guild had never quite taken Cecily to heart. She was admired, yes, and nodded to. Yet there had been no true fondness. In a village that traded in comfort and belonging, Cecily had remained a closed room, and now in death the latch had lifted slightly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple happened upon Mrs. Jeffer in the lane by the war memorial, polishing the brass name plates, as she did each week. Her gloves were frayed, her breath faintly wheezy with effort. You know, said the widow without prompting. I saw her here just 3 days ago. The vicar's wife, I mean. Miss Marple gave a soft, oh, and waited. She stood there for the longest while, not reading the names. No, not really. Just staring at that middle column. Miss Marple followed her gaze. The name Lawrence Harwood stood among the others, a captain in the Royal Medical Corps. She cried, added Mrs. Jeff, lowering her voice. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now she paused, pressing a hand to her side. "There's always something, isn't there?" Miss Marple thanked her gently and walked on. The roses along the path to the vicarage bent softly in the breeze. One had broken at the neck. The following morning, while Miss Marple helped the maid fold linens for the guest drawer, a small object slid from the corner of Cecil's sewing box. It was a military medal, polished, wrapped in a handkerchief no larger than a hand. The name engraved on the rim was Captain Lawrence Harwood. Miss Marple paused. She turned the medal over, noting its worn ribbon and the faint scratch near the clasp, as if someone had worn it often, then suddenly stopped. When asked, the housemaid confessed she'd never seen it before, nor had Alan Brett mentioned it, though he had quite formally given over Cecil's personal items to be inventoried. Miss Marple slipped the medal into its cloth again and replaced it with care. She did not ask the vicar about it yet, but she remembered the name carved into the war memorial and the way Cecil's fingers had trembled ever so slightly at the fete. It was not the object itself that troubled her. It was the impression of something cherished, then hidden, and that sort of concealment always carried weight. It was Miss Briley who brought the photograph, unsure whether to burn it or pass it along. "I found it in the drawer of the writing desk," she explained quietly. "I thought perhaps the lady's family might want it." Miss Marple took the photo between her fingers. A seaside hotel, clearly taken in summer. Susie, unmistakably younger but recognizable in profile, stood with her arm linked around a man's shoulder. His face, however, had been scratched out, not merely crossed through, but gouged with something sharp. The tear had punctured the photo surface. Not a moment of grief, but deliberate removal. She didn't speak of him. Miss Marple asked. Miss Briley shook her head. Never spoke of anyone really. The housekeeper left the room, and Miss Marple remained with the photograph. She considered not the missing face, but the way Susie leaned into the man's shoulder, unposed, familiar, at ease. The kind of posture that spoke of intimacy, not ceremony. Some part of her life had been erased, and someone had wanted it to stay that way. At Thursday's choir rehearsal, the choir master, Mr. Harold Pence, was noticeably subdued. Known for his light humor and tidy mustache, he had not joked once during the session. Outside the church, murmurs followed him like autumn leaves. He was always rather fond of the vicar's wife, said Miss Harrow, drawing out the word fond with careful implication. Too fond, some said. Miss Marple, who had arrived to drop off a shawl for Mrs. Lyle, did not comment, but she noted that when Harold Pence passed her by, he glanced only once, nervously, and looked quickly away. In Fern Hollow, such glances often spoke louder than words. Miss Briley had served the vicarage for nearly 5 years, long enough to know the household intimately, but not so long as to be considered irreplaceable. She was tidy, discreet, and deeply respectful. Yet, in the days since Cecil's death, her manner had shifted from solemn to something more guarded. She kept her distance from the drawing-room, busied herself in tasks not yet needed, and spoke of the late Mrs. Brett in stiff, rehearsed phrases. She was delicate, Miss Briley offered, drying silver spoons one by one. Not always suited to village life, but she did her best. Miss Marple inclined her head. "And you were fond of her?" A pause. "I respected her." The distinction was not lost on Miss Marple, nor was the faint tightness that crept into Miss Briley's voice when Alan Brett entered the hallway. Devotion, when mixed with silence, often carried a bitterness unspoken. On her way to the post office, Miss Marple met Mrs. Wendell, the soldier's widow, whose son's name also appeared on the war memorial. They exchanged customary pleasantries until Mrs. Wendell paused, eyes on the cobblestones. She wasn't who she seemed, the woman said abruptly. Susie, there was something in her eyes, like she was always bracing for a letter that never came. Miss Marple waited. "My boy Peter served with a man called Harwood in the medical corps. Good man," he said. "Kept something quiet once for someone he shouldn't have." Her voice dropped. "Peter never came home. Not after that mission, and Harwood disappeared." The implication was as faint as the breeze. Miss Marple touched the sleeve of the woman's coat gently. Grief has many echoes in a village like Fern Hollow. Some are carved into stone, others into silence, but neither are easily erased. It was 2 days after the garden fade when Miss Marple found herself seated once more in the drawing-room of the vicarage opposite Alan Brett. The room had not changed, flowers still fresh, furniture neat, the afternoon light falling gently on the carpet, but the presence that once filled it had gone, leaving a stillness that was not peace. The vicar sat with his hands loosely clasped, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the teacups. He did not speak at first, and when he did, it was with the slow formality of a man composing his own footnote. "My wife was not made for parish life," he said at length. "She tried very hard, I dare say, but it never quite suited her." Miss Marple offered a gentle nod, allowing the words to settle. She had a past that did not prepare her for such sameness. Parish life is rhythm and repetition and comfort. Susie came from chaos, I think, and chaos leaves marks. He spoke of her as one might describe a figure in a stained glass window, removed, idealized, but distant. Not a word of endearment passed his lips. Not a trace of devastation touched his brow. Miss Marple, ever mild, stirred her tea once before, saying softly, "It is strange, isn't it, how some people endure war only to find peace less bearable than the danger?" The vicar did not reply. At the village school, Miss Marple found Miss Harrow just finishing her lesson on arithmetic, her blackboard lined with neatly chalked numbers and small sums. The woman was brisk, upright, and proud of the discipline she maintained. Yet she softened when asked about Susie bread. She came to help with the sewing afternoons, Miss Harrow explained. Once a week, never missed. And the children asked Miss Marple. They liked her well enough. Miss Harrow replied, though she had her favorites, one in particular, Michael Ashcraft. At the sound of the name, Miss Marple looked up. "He's a quiet boy," the school mistress continued. "Orphan lives with the Denomes up near the mill road, but he clung to her in his own way. Always sat nearest, brought her scraps of fabric for the patchwork." Miss Marple folded her gloves slowly. "Did she ever speak of him outside the classroom?" "Not directly," said Miss Harrow. "But I remember once he said something strange after a sewing lesson. He looked at me very seriously and said, 'She's not just the vicar's wife. She's my mom.'" Miss Marple did not betray surprise. "And what did you say?" "I told him not to be silly." Miss Harrow replied briskly, "But he meant it, Miss Marple." That boy believed it. As Miss Marple walked home from the school, the name lingered in her mind like a low chime. Michael Ashcraft. She turned it over with the silent precision of one who had long ago trained herself to listen closely to names, to echoes, to subtle repetitions that others missed. Ashcraft. It was not common, though not particularly rare, but coupled with Cecil's strange bond with the child, her attentiveness, the unusual warmth she showed him, her tendency to linger near the war memorial, where names from another life were etched in stone, it became something more than coincidence. Miss Marple had seen such things before, the quiet gravitation of a woman toward a child not her own, but somehow hers all the same. And always there was something unspoken beneath it, a story half buried, its roots pushing up through small gestures and unshed tears. She did not draw conclusions. Not yet, but she felt the threads tighten, and as she passed the churchyard gate, she thought again of the way Cecily had looked at the memorial, as though reading a secret written in the names. At the village shop, amid weighing scales and ginger biscuits, Miss Marple made quiet inquiries. Wartime memories, though blurred at the edges, still lived in Fern Hollow, especially when stirred by suggestion rather than demand. "Susie," said Mrs. Ridgway, leaning forward with interest. "Oh, yes. She was a nurse, wasn't she? Stationed in Oxford, I heard. Or maybe just outside. She was, how shall I put it, attached to one of the patients," added Mrs. Lyle, in the measured tone of a woman who knew when gossip ended and scandal began. "A young soldier, officer class, very bad nerves, I believe. Went missing. Some sort of episode never found. Didn't her family hush it up?" Someone asked. "No family to speak of from what I heard," Mrs. Ridgway said with a shrug. "Only an aunt in Somerset, and a brother no one seen in years." "And the young man?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Dead, I should think," said Mrs. Lyle. "Or vanished with good reason." There was a pause, as if a silence had entered the room uninvited. Then a change of subject, as village decency required, but the impression lingered. A woman marked by her something she had not buried deep enough. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, overlooking the garden of the vicarage. The sky had begun to turn the soft color of memory, faded rose and lavender gray. A small wind stirred the hollyhocks. She thought not of poison, nor even of murder. She thought of wounds, those left untended, not on the body, but in the heart. Susie had walked the lanes of Fern Hollow with grace and restraint, had poured tea and arranged flowers, had smiled where smiles were expected. But Miss Marple knew that such careful choreography came at a cost. To carry grief privately, to press it down for the sake of appearances. These were not unknown to women of her generation. Yet Cecil's grief had not been dry. It had leaked through her gaze, through her strange attachment to the boy, through the absence of joy, even in moments of beauty. What pain had she carried alone? What child had she lost? What love had she sacrificed to duty, to shame, to silence? Miss Marple folded her hands. The scent of honeysuckle drifted up. In her long experience, pain of that sort did not fade. It deepened until it formed motive. On Friday morning, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Ernie Fletcher on the path leading past the old rectory wall. He had served in the war alongside Alanbrett, or so the vicar had once said. A quiet man, he now kept bees, and spoke rarely of the past. But over a slow walk and a shared memory of ration tea, Miss Marple asked a gentle question. "Did you know Susie before she was Mrs. Brett?" Mr. Fletcher paused. "Only what I heard." "And what was that?" He rubbed his hand along the top of the garden fence. "There was a fellow Lawrence Harwood. Captain had a breakdown in the spring of '44. Shell shock took to her, they said, very fast. Too fast, maybe. And then one day he was gone. No one told her properly, just gone. Army files say missing. We all knew what that meant." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And she changed," he said simply, like someone closed the shutters behind her eyes, never quite opened them again. As the morning sun warmed the hedge, Miss Marple walked on, feeling the shape of the truth rise into sharper relief. Not a scandal, not a seduction, a secret that had once been nearly love, then broken, forgotten by everyone but the one left behind. The home of Mrs. Forsyth stood at the farthest corner of Fern Hollow, a low ivy-thickened cottage with curtains that seldom stirred. Once the sister of a respected colonel, and now long widowed, Mrs. Forsyth lived in firm retreat from society, her memory still keen, though she chose carefully when to reveal it. Miss Marple brought with her a jar of green-gage preserve, and with it a warm manner that needed no pretext. After polite remarks about the weather and the unreliability of the mill delivery, she inquired in her gentle roundabout way whether Mrs. Forsyth had ever received a visit from Susie Bread. The old woman straightened. "Yes," she said at length, her tone as brittle as bone china. "She came once alone, looked pale, shaken if I'm honest, sat in that chair, your very chair, and asked if I still kept the safe box my brother left behind." Miss Marple inclined her head, not too quickly. "She left an envelope with me. Said it was important, not to be opened unless something happened to her." Her voice so precise, so calm, but her hands trembled like leaves in a wind. "Did she say what it contained?" "Not a word," said Mrs. Forsyth, "only that it might not be safe in the vicarage. The preserve was accepted. The envelope was not offered." Miss Marple rose soon after, her mind already turning toward what fear could drive a vicar's wife into the arms of a recluse with a locked box. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple entered the village post office. Miss Phelan, the postmistress, sat behind the counter with her knitting, half a row short of the heel of a sock. Her spectacles rested on the bridge of her nose, and her manner was both sharp and pleasant in equal measure. Mrs. Brett was a regular, she confirmed. Always came in alone. Always posted something registered. To Oxford, Miss Marple inquired lightly. To a university address, yes, and always signed the book as Mrs. L. Harwood. Odd, isn't it? She peered over her spectacles. I didn't pry, of course. Not our place, is it? But one notices things. Did she seem distressed? No, said Miss Phelan thoughtfully. Not distressed, determined, like a woman tying up loose ends without saying so. The name Harwood lingered in the air long after MissMarple stepped out into the lane. It did not surprise her. Nothing Cicely did now seem misplaced, but it did clarify something long suspected. Cicely had not only been hiding a story, she had been writing one of her own to someone or for someone. The only question was, had it ever arrived? The weather turned damp that afternoon. MissMarple had returned to the vicarage for her shawl when she found Miss Briley kneeling by the hearth in the drawing-room, poker in hand, her face oddly tense. "I was clearing yesterday's fire," she explained quickly. "Thought it best to keep things tidy." Amid the ash and charred ends, something pale and stiff had not entirely burned. MissMarple stooped gently, retrieving a torn, singed corner of thick paper, ink faintly visible where the flame had not reached. It was a letter, unmistakably so, folded twice, the edges scorched, the middle bearing Cecil's handwriting, sharp, neat, deliberate. The ink was blurred, but legible in parts. "Believe he is here still. I never stopped. Someone knows and warned me." MissMarple let the scrap fall gently back into the ash. Miss Briley, still holding the poker, stared a moment too long before speaking. "Some things are best let go." Her voice held no menace, only something cold and resigned, like a woman who had watched a slow decline from too near, and convinced herself it was necessary. MissMarple said nothing, but the words on that ruined page refused to vanish from her thoughts. Cicely had not only believed her child lived, she had feared the knowledge was dangerous. That evening, MissMarple sat quietly in her room, the scorched corner of the letter laid beside her knitting basket. The sentences, though broken, formed a shape too clear to be misunderstood. This was no vague longing. Cicely had known, not hoped, not wondered, but known that her son, the child given up so many years ago, had ended up in Fern Hollow, and someone else had known it too, someone who had tried to frighten her into silence. Yet, more chilling than the warning was the act of suppression. The letter had not been misplaced. It had been intercepted and burned. That took intention, and it had not been Cecil's hand that had cast it into the fire. MissMarple knew the difference between coincidence and quiet sabotage, between grief and guilt. This was no act of a woman slipping into despair. It was the cry of a mother silenced not by sorrow, but by someone close, close enough to read her letters, to understand her meaning, and to destroy it before it reached the world. She folded the paper fragment and returned it to her bag. It had not been meant for her, but it would be remembered all the same. It was on her way to the grocer's that MissMarple encountered Mrs. Jeffer, once more tending to her roses. The widow, never short of opinion, leaned across the gate with a look that was part warning, part confession. "I saw her, you know," she said abruptly, "at the post office more than once." MissMarple gave a small smile. "Oh, she'd wait until it was nearly closing. Thought no one would see her, but I go for my magazines on Thursdays. You've seen me do it. She'd be there posting her little letters, tucked under a handkerchief like secrets. She didn't know she was seen. She never looked up," Mrs. Jeffrey said with something between pity and pride. "But I saw enough. A woman doesn't wrap letters like that unless she's afraid of who's watching." MissMarple nodded. "And who did you suppose was watching?" The widow hesitated. She lived in that house with a man who never smiled and a woman who watched her husband too closely. That's all I'll say." MissMarple thanked her and walked on. In villages like Fern Hollow, such statements were often delivered as riddles, but always rooted in something true. That evening, MissMarple strolled alone along the lane between the vicarage and the schoolhouse. It was a walk Cicely had taken often along the hedge, past a stone wall, sometimes with a book, more often with nothing at all. How strange, MissMarple thought, that a woman could live in plain sight and yet be so entirely unseen. Cicely had performed every duty, worn every proper smile, poured every cup of tea. Yet no one had truly known her, not even perhaps her husband. In the end, it was not hatred that had undone her, nor even passion. It was shame, the kind buried not by scandal, but by silence. The kind the church knows how to preserve, and small villages know how to punish, without ever speaking aloud. She had tried to reach out through envelopes, through secrets hidden behind lavender-scented linen, through a broken photograph and an engraved medal, and each time someone had quietly closed the door again. But the past does not stay buried because it is inconvenient, and Miss Marple, who had seen all manner of grief and guilt, knew well that the deeper the secret, the louder its echo when it finally surfaces. It was just past midday when the whisper began, small, uncertain, and yet curiously loud, despite the hush in which it traveled. Michael Ashcraftofft had not come home from Sunday school. Mrs. Denham, who fostered the boy, had assumed he was helping the school mistress put away hymnals. But when tea time came and no sign of him appeared, she walked to the church herself, only to find the school locked and the rooms empty. Within an hour, the lanes of Fern Hollow filled with quiet urgency. Men walked the hedge. Women leaned from cottage doors. Yet there was no shouting, no public alarm. In villages such as Fern Hollow, crisis occurred beneath the surface, like water moving beneath ice. Miss Marple, seated on the green bench outside the vicarage, heard the news from a breathless child, who added, without malice, "He was the one she liked best, wasn't he?" The vicar's wife. It struck her then, not with surprise, but with inevitability. The boy, quiet and thoughtful, had been at the center of Cecil's final weeks. Not by accident, not by whim, and now he was gone. She did not ask questions. She simply rose, gathered her gloves, and began walking towards the church. By even song, the vicar had chosen to speak. The pews were more crowded than usual, the atmosphere brittle. Alan Brett stood behind the lectern, his cast sack hanging too heavily against his shoulders, as though burdened by some private weight. "I ask you," he said, voice low but caring to avoid speculation. "Michael is surely safe, and will be found by morning. He has been through much in his young life, and it is not unusual for such children to seek solitude now and then." His hand, resting on the carved edge of the pulpit, shook slightly but perceptibly. Miss Marple, from her pew near the font, saw it clearly. She had seen hands like that before, not the trembling of fear, but of effort, the effort to control a narrative. When he stepped down, his face was pale. Miss Marple caught his eye briefly, and it flickered. Not recognition, reluctance. Outside, the villagers murmured as they departed, but no one lingered too long. By dusk, the lanes were quiet once more, and still no sign of Michael. It was Miss Briley who found him, Mr. Harold Pence. Early the next morning, she had gone to the mill pond to gather water crest for the kitchen. The mist still clung to the surface like gauze, and there by the broken willow lay the choir-master's body. The constable was called, the pond cordoned off, and the body removed in solemn silence. But it was the note in his coat pocket that stirred the most whispers. Crumpled, half-soaked, and written in a nervous, uneven hand, it read only, "It should have been me." By noon, the parish was thick with rumor. Miss Marple stood quietly near the pond's edge, watching the swirls left by the recovery ropes. Mr. Pence had been Cecil's friend, more than friend, if one believed the tone of certain village remarks. He had grown increasingly withdrawn since her death, his usual lightness replaced with something bitter and brittle. No one said it was suicide, not aloud, but it hung in the air. Miss Marple remembered the look he gave her at the church, the guilt, the avoidance, and now this final gesture. But what precisely did he believe should have been him? A confession, a punishment, or protection for a truth too painful to speak? Miss Marple visited the church later that day. The key was easy enough to obtain. The VGR had long trusted her discretion. The vestry smelled of beeswax and paper, and the large black-bound registers sat in their locked case, undisturbed, except by official hands. She found the baptismal records from the past 12 years, running her fingers along the entries as one might trace a fading memory. It was there, 2/3 down a page, just beneath a clearly written Ashcraftofft baptism, that she saw it. A smudge, unusual, for this register was meticulously kept. A line of ink had been disrupted, blurred just enough to obscure a surname. Not crossed out, not erased, but altered. A careless finger, or something more deliberate. She studied the ink around the entry. Beneath the smudge, faint impressions remained. Evidence that someone had written something and someone else had tried to hide it. It was not Michael's name, but it connected to his birth, possibly to Cecil's handwriting. Possibly not. Miss Marple replaced the volume quietly. The smudge was not a mistake. It was the faint outline of someone trying to rewrite a truth they wished had never existed. Later that evening, Miss Marple encountered Miss Brierly in the hallway of the vicarage, dusting an already polished shelf. The housekeeper's eyes were rimmed red. Not with grief, Miss Marple thought, but with fatigue. Not the fatigue of labor, but of restraint. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said gently, "but I wondered, has Michael ever been here at the vicarage after school hours?" Miss Brierly paused. The cloth in her hand stiffened. Perhaps once he brought a book to Mrs. Brett, a gift." "And did he stay?" A longer pause. "She gave him biscuits in the parlor. That was all." Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. "You didn't see him yesterday, then?" "I know, it came too quickly. I was airing the spare linens." Miss Marple thanked her as if satisfied, but as she turned to go, she caught the smallest flicker in the housekeeper's eyes. A glance not at Miss Marple, but toward the closed door of the cellar pantry. Somewhere in the house, a door had remained unlocked. Somewhere, someone had hid, not left. By the end of that week, Fern Hollow had grown weary with dread. The disappearance of a child, the death of a man, the silence of a house. It weighed upon the hedge, upon the hymns sung with subdued voices, upon the very light that fell across the lanes. But in Miss Marple's mind, a pattern had begun to emerge, faint but undeniable. She had seen it before in other villages, in other lives. The way past sorrow shaped present danger. Suzalie had lost a child once, given him up, or had him taken, and now another child, perhaps the same, had been at risk again. The question was not only who had tried to silence her, but why? To protect whom? Mr. Pants had believed himself responsible, perhaps for abandoning her long ago, perhaps for returning too late. But it was someone else who had feared exposure, who had altered the records, who had seen Michael not as a child, but as a threat. Miss Marple saw it now. A substitution of names. A silence imposed by shame and guilt. The old kind buried deep enough that it warped everything around it. The truth was close, and someone somewhere had already felt it closing in. Miss Marple's walk to the parish archives took her past the war memorial, past the hedges that now whispered of more than wind, and into the back room of the village hall, where yellowed files, registers, and memorial rolls had been kept by generations of Clarks. She asked politely for the wartime parish logs, and was handed a battered green folder with pages in neat clerical hand. It did not take long to find the name. Captain Lawrence Harwood, Royal Army Medical Corps. Missing in action, 1944. Next to the entry was a small note in a different hand. Personal effects returned to next of kin C.W. Brett née Harwood. The name struck like a quiet bell. Miss Marple had never been told Cecilie's maiden name. Yet here it was, plain and utterly binding. Lawrence Harwood. The name engraved on the medal found in Cecil's drawer. The face scratched out from the seaside photograph. The man Suzalie had tried and failed to forget. The records held nothing more, but it was enough. Suzalie had not only loved him, she had been his family, a sister, a cousin, or something unspoken. Miss Marple closed the folder gently. The medal had not been a memento. It had been an anchor, one that someone had tried, not too subtly, to cast overboard. It was at the county hospital in a Clark's back room, where birth records were indexed on cards like recipe tabs, that Miss Marple found the confirmation she had half expected. A boy born January 1945. No father listed. Mother Cecilie Harwood. Residence temporary nurse quarters. Oxford. Infant assigned to temporary care pending adoption. No official follow-up. No name. She read the card twice. There was no mention of Lawrence Harwood, but the dates aligned too precisely to ignore. So did the circumstances. A war nurse, a missing officer, a child surrendered in the shadow of scandal. Miss Marple returned the card with careful fingers. She did not need more than what was already there. The silence said enough. Her birth hidden beneath bureaucracy. A child placed under another name. A woman who had never truly relinquished the belief that her son still lived. And if Suzalie had believed Michael Ashcraft was that child, then all her behavior, her protectiveness, her sorrow, her fear took on a meaning no one in the village had thought to consider. But Miss Marple had seen it before. Where love is interrupted by war, consequences linger in unexpected forms. Through a retired solicitor in St. Maryme, who owed her a favor or two, Miss Marple confirmed what the hospital could not, that in 1954, Cecily Harwood, then using her married name, Brett, had filed a petition with the county court to access records pertaining to a child she had relinquished a decade earlier. The request had been denied. The file was brief, the language official and cold. Request denied. Information sealed. No grounds presented for revision of status. Identity of adoptive family protected under law. Miss Marple traced her gloved finger down the last line. There had been no appeal. She imagined Cecily seated in some graystone office presenting her request with precise dignity and hearing. At the end of it all, a quiet refusal. Not a fight, not a confrontation, just a wall, impersonal, absolute, and final. No wonder she had come to Fern Hollow. If she had reason to believe the child was there, even without proof, then proximity was all that remained to her. She had married the vicar, not for comfort, but for access, for nearness. And someone had known. Someone had wanted her kept silent, for reasons that had nothing to do with pity. On a gray afternoon, with a promise of rain, Miss Marple passed the churchyard. She was neither hidden nor bold, simply present, as an older lady might be while counting names or feeding crows. From behind the hedge near the yew trees, she watched the vicar. Alan Brett stood alone, a small bouquet of chrysanthemums in his hand, white and yellow, the sort often left not by family, but by duty. He did not approach Cecil's grave. Instead, he walked to a small, nearly forgotten corner, where an unmarked stone lay flat in the grass. No name, no verse, just a shallow cross chipped into weathered gray. There he knelt and laid the flowers without ceremony. Then, after a pause longer than necessary, he stood and walked back without a backward glance. Miss Marple did not follow. She stood a moment longer, the soft weight of the scene settling into her bones. Who had been buried there? A stillborn child? A scandal unspoken? A name removed from history with the same steady hand that had altered the baptismal register. She had her suspicions. The vicar had placed no flowers on Cecil's grave, but he had mourned something or someone. And if one knew where a man placed his grief, one often found where he had buried his guilt. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple requested access to the parish reports, those tidy-bound volumes that summarized births, deaths, marriages, and notable events. The housemaid, under the impression that Miss Marple was preparing a memoir, retrieved them without comment. As she flipped through the years, Miss Marple noted something peculiar. Cecil's name appeared less frequently than it ought to have. In the early years, she was mentioned, organizing flowers, arranging a fete listed in the Women's Auxiliary Committee. But after 1957, her name all but vanished. No acknowledgement of her teaching the sewing group. No mention of her support at the school. No record of her attendance at vestry meetings. Nothing after her first few years in Fern Hollow. It was not that she had withdrawn. Miss Marple knew she hadn't. Cecily had continued all her work, but someone somewhere had failed to record it or chosen not to. A subtle disappearance, one rarely noticed except by those who knew what presence ought to look like. Miss Marple closed the volume softly. Erasure is often more dangerous than defamation. It leaves no wounds, only absence. As twilight deepened over the village, Miss Marple returned once more to the churchyard, her steps deliberate, her thoughts tightly woven. She stood where Cecily had once wept before the war memorial. She looked down at the names Harwood, Ashcrafttoft, Brett. Each name told a partial truth. Each name had been used, hidden, or left unsaid. And so she asked the question, not aloud, but in her mind, as only Miss Marple could. Had Cecily been silenced to protect the child? Or had she died to protect someone else's reputation? A woman like Cecily might be tolerated, even pied. But once she began to reach toward old records, toward a boy who bore resemblance and surname, she had become a threat. Not for what she had done, but for what she knew. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the vicarage beyond the hedge. The shutters were drawn, the lamps inside had been lit early, a name erased, a child hidden, a confession burned. It was all very neat and very English. But even the neatest of secrets has a seam, and Miss Marple was already preparing to unpick it. The vestry of St. Swithin's was quiet in the late afternoon. The last of the light fell through the stained glass, casting a subdued warmth over the polished wood and worn hymns. Miss Marple, seated near the vestry table, had asked only that certain individuals be present for a private matter of conscience. The vicar stood composed but pale. Miss Briley hovered near the doorway, hands folded too tightly. Mrs. Jeff, summoned under the pretext of a women's guild matter, sat stiffly, her eyes darting. The schoolmistress, Miss Harrow, had come reluctantly, and Michael Ashcraft-Toft, clean and freshly combed, sat in the care of the churchwarden's wife. He looked not afraid, but faintly puzzled. Each person present held something, a suspicion, a piece of memory, a corner of the truth, and yet none knew the full design. Miss Marple, calm as ever, looked to the floor before she began. It is often said that villages like ours are quiet, but quietness, she remarked gently, is not the absence of trouble, only the careful covering of it. No one replied. The air was still. She looked at each of them in turn. I believe you all deserve to know what really happened to Susie Brett and why. And with that, the silence turned to attention. Miss Marple began with a story, not of death, but of love. Not the sentimental kind, but the sort pressed between duty and shame. Many years ago, she said, a young nurse named Cecily Harwood served at a military hospital in Oxford. There she cared for a man, a captain, Lawrence Harwood, who, whether through circumstance or affection, became part of her life in a way she never disclosed. She paused briefly. She bore a child, and as was often the case for women of her time, unmarried and unguarded by fortune, the child was placed for adoption. It was done legally, discreetly, and entirely without her control. Her sound stirred from the corner. The vicar's face had stiffened, but Susie never forgot. Miss Marple continued. She later came to believe that her son had been raised here in Fern Hollow. She married Mr. Brett, not for convenience, but for closeness. She believed that Michael Ashcraft-Toft, the quiet boy drawn to her so naturally, was her son. She looked toward Michael, whose eyes were wide but attentive. She had no proof, only instinct and love, a mother's love, suppressed but not extinguished. And for a moment, not even the tick of the clock dared speak. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the vicar, not accusingly, but with a sadness more cutting than condemnation. Susie, I believe, wrote to the bishop, a letter calm, detailed, pleading only for truth. She intended no harm, only recognition. The vicar stood very still. But you read that letter before it left her hands. His eyes did not waver, but his knuckles widened. You feared what it would reveal, that you had married a woman with a past, that a child you had not fathered might become known as your own, that your parish, your position, your reputation might suffer. She let the weight of that settle. So you did the unthinkable. You added linenum to her tea, disguised by the tincture she took for nerves. You did it not out of rage, but fear. And then when she collapsed, you held her hand, grieving not for her, but for the risk that had passed. The vicar did not speak, but no one looked at him with pity. Not now. It was Mrs. Jeff who murmured, "And Mr. Pence?" Miss Marple turned gently. Mr. Pence knew Susie long ago. I believe they were briefly engaged during the war. He abandoned her, not cruelly perhaps, but carelessly. She folded her hands. When he realized who she had become, and what had happened to her, he was overwhelmed with guilt. I believe he knew more than he admitted. Perhaps he recognized Michael's resemblance to Lawrence Harwood. Perhaps Susie had confided in him. She paused, her voice softening, but instead of coming forward, he carried that burden silently. And when Susie died, and he sensed what had truly happened, he could not forgive himself. The note in his pocket had said it all. It should have been me. He believed he had failed her again, and so he let the water take him. Miss Marple lowered her gaze briefly. No one spoke. Some griefs she knew required no elaboration. "And the letter," said Miss Harrow, her voice brittle. "Was it destroyed?" Miss Marple turned at last to Miss Briley. The housekeeper stood still, like someone waiting for a sentence already known. "You took it," Miss Marple said softly. You found it before the vicar could, perhaps. Or perhaps he showed it to you, seeking reassurance. Miss Briley's lips parted, but no words came. You believed you were protecting the church, that Cecil's revelation would bring scandal, undo the careful work of decades. So you burned the letter. You saw it as sacrifice. Miss Briley bowed her head. There was no denial. Miss Marple looked at her not with anger, but with the deep melancholy of a woman who had seen many well-meaning souls become complicit in cruelties they did not understand until it was too late. Silence, Miss Marple said, has never served truth, and when it claims the innocent, it becomes a form of violence. The vestry was utterly still. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Michael. The boy had not spoken, but his eyes held something older than his years, an awareness shaped not by understanding, but by feeling. He had always sensed that Suzalie had loved him. He had not needed proof. She wanted only to tell you, Miss Marple said gently, not to change your life, only to offer you the name you never knew you had. Michael nodded once solemnly. Mrs. Denholm reached out and took his hand. Miss Marple looked to the others. Suzalie Brett was a woman of quiet strength. She harmed no one. She kept her pain hidden to avoid disturbing others. And for that she was silenced, but not forgotten. The vestry door opened onto evening. Truth had found its way in. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the calm dignity that Suzalie herself might have chosen. And in the heart of a boy who now knew her name, something lost had quietly been restored. The garden at St. Mary was at its most serene. June had brought out the full blush of the rose bushes, their petals heavy with scent, their leaves barely stirred by the breeze. Miss Marple sat beneath the old white trellis, a teapot steeping gently beside her, and across the table, Miss Wetherby unfolded a lace serviette with quiet dignity. "You were gone longer than a fortnight, dear," Miss Wetherby remarked, passing the milk with the unhurried poise of someone who never asked more than a friend would willingly offer. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Fern Hollow had more layers than I first thought." Miss Wetherby waited as she always did, never pressing, never impatient. "There was a woman," Miss Marple said softly, "who tried to do right by everyone except herself, and in doing so, she was misunderstood by nearly all of them." Miss Wetherby nodded. "That sounds familiar." They sipped their tea. The silence was the sort that carried respect, not absence. Miss Marple reached forward and clipped a spent bloom from the nearby rose. She tried to bring something into the light, but it was easier for some to snuff out the candle. Miss Wetherby said nothing, but her hand, when it touched Miss Marple's, lingered with quiet affection. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her gaze on the far garden wall where ivy climbed like a green whisper. "I've often thought," she said, "that the church asks its faithful to confess sins in order to be forgiven, but it rarely forgives those who confess inconvenient truths." Miss Wetherby blinked slowly. "You're thinking of Suzalie." "I'm thinking of every woman who has been punished, not for what she did, but for daring to remember it." She folded her hands in her lap. "Reputation is a fragile thing, you know, like fine china. Some will do anything to keep it from cracking, even if it means sacrificing the one thing more valuable than reputation: truth." Miss Wetherby offered no sermon, only a faint sigh that sounded like understanding. "It never is the scandal itself that does harm," Miss Marple added after a moment. "It's the silence that follows it." In Fern Hollow, life resumed. The lanes dried after the June rains. The bell at St. Swin's tolled once more with measured solemnity, and no one spoke above a whisper about the vicar's sudden departure to a mission post in Wales. Michael Ashcraft returned to his school desk. He answered when called, smiled politely, and kept a folded photograph in his drawer, one no longer scratched through. The Denholms did not question him about it, but sometimes on his walk home he would pause near the war memorial, where a name lingered in stone, and beside it in his memory the gentle voice of a woman who had once sewn patches with him and tucked a biscuit into his pocket with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple did not return to Fern Hollow. She did not need to. Some places are best remembered once the dust has settled and the breath has returned to stillness. But she thought of Suzalie often, not as a victim, as a woman who had loved quietly and lost completely, yet still left behind a truth that could not be erased. And that in the end was what justice really looked like. Some mysteries do not end with the clang of handcuffs or the glare of newspaper headlines. Some resolve themselves in gardens blooming with roses over a pot of quiet tea between two elderly women. In the end, Miss Marple did not expose a villain. She uncovered something far more delicate: the ache of a mother's heart, the toll of reputation, and the quiet endurance of women whose stories are never told aloud. Cecil's tragedy was not only in her death, but in the way her life had been quietly folded away, hidden behind hymns and linen drawers. Yet through small observations and gentle persistence, Miss Marple ensured that Cecily was at last seen. And Michael, he may never know the full truth, but perhaps sometimes the heart remembers what the mind is too young to understand. Now, let me ask you this. Do you believe Cecily was right to return and seek out the boy, even knowing the scandal it might bring? Or should she have let the past rest as the village so dearly wanted?